the next 10 minutes or so talking about the neuroscience of meditation. I promise you I'm not going to just list off a bunch of different brain areas that are active during meditation. That wouldn't be useful to you. In fact, I don't believe in throwing out a lot of nomenclature without also giving some mechanistic explanation as to what different brain areas do. And you could say, well, what good is it knowing what different brain areas do and their names if I can't actually manipulate those brain areas? But the good news is you actually can manipulate those brain areas. As I'll tell you today, you can turn up the activity in certain brain areas and turn down the activity in specific brain areas with specific elements of a meditation practice. So that's quite exciting and quite different, really, from other aspects of neuroscience that we might discuss on this podcast. So there are a few different brain areas whose names I'd like to arm you with. And again, the names themselves aren't essential, but if you can grasp even the top contour of what I'm about to say, you'll be in a much better position to parse and use the information that follows. There's an area of your brain that sits right behind your forehead that's called the prefrontal cortex. Basically, it's the front bumper of your head, just behind the bone, okay? That area just behind your forehead that we call the prefrontal cortex actually encompasses a lot of different things. And actually, you have two of them. You have one on the right side of your brain and you have one on the left side of your brain. And they're connected to one another, but they actually do different things. The area that I'd like to focus on today for a bit is the so-called left prefrontal cortex. Or if we were going to get really specific, we'd say the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Dorsal means up, lateral means to the side. So if you want to touch the left side of your head and move your hand just toward the midline, toward the sort of top of your head a little bit, so that's dorsal. And then lateral, as long as your hand is still on the side of your head, you're in the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, so you've got your hand probably right over your left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That area of the brain we know from lesion studies where it's been damaged in animals or humans, and we know from stimulation studies where it's been selectively stimulated in animals, or yes, indeed, also it's been done in humans, has an incredible ability to control your bodily senses and to make sense, that is to interpret what's going on in terms of your emotions and your bodily sensations. So from now on, unless I say otherwise, if I say prefrontal cortex, I'm specifically referring to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but I'm going to shorten that up just for sake of simplicity and ease of communication. If I'm going to talk about another area of prefrontal cortex, I'll talk about another area. But if I say prefrontal cortex today, what I mean is left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Stimulation of left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or I should say more appropriately, when your left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is active, you are in a great position to interpret what's going on with you emotionally, to interpret your bodily signals of comfort or discomfort, and then to make really good decisions on the basis of that interpretation. And that's because the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is in direct communication with and is directly connected to another brain area called the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. Now, I'm just going to refer to it as the ACC, okay? The ACC is an area of your brain that is interpreting a lot of different things about bodily signals. For instance, how fast you're breathing, whether or not your heart is beating quickly or slowly, and more importantly, whether or not your heart is beating quickly or slowly for the circumstance that you are in. So for instance, if you're running up a hill and you're even in great shape and your heart is beating very fast, it's unlikely that you are going to be concerned about your heart beating fast because that is appropriate for the circumstance. However, if you're just walking along and all of a sudden your heart starts beating very quickly for no apparent reason, well then you are going to interpret that as either pathologic or uncomfortable, inappropriate for the context that you happen to be in. The left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain that actually has some control over and especially can interpret what's going on in this ACC region. Now, most of you probably haven't heard of the ACC. Most of you probably have heard of a brain area called the amygdala. It's an almond-shaped structure on the two sides of the brain. People talk about it as the fear center, etc. But your ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, gets input from areas like the amygdala, your threat detection centers, but it also gets input from an enormous number of other areas of your brain and body, including your heart, your gut. So it gets information about how full, that is distended, or how empty your gut is. It gets information about how quickly you're breathing from input from your lungs and related structures. It's an absolutely critical station for making sense of what's going on in your body. And it works very closely along with one other structure. And I promise this is going to be the third structure in this triad, and then I'll stop listing off names. So we have dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Think of that as sort of the interpreter of what's going on inside of you. You have the ACC, or anterior cingulate cortex, which is the area of your brain that's bringing in all this information about what's going on inside your body and even on the surface of your body. If you have any pain or an itch or a mosquito bite on the surface of your body, your ACC would definitely register that. And then there's this other absolutely incredible brain structure, which is called the insula, I-N-S-U-L-A, insula. And the insula has a bunch of different parts to it. But the insula is another area that is interpreting signals of what's going on in your brain and body. So the ACC and the insula are working together to try and figure out, what's going on inside me. And in addition to that, the insula is interpreting information about what's going on outside of you. So your insula is saying, for instance, hey, this is a steep hill that I'm running up. And as a consequence, whatever heart rate increase that I'm experiencing or heavy breathing or burning in my lungs, this all makes sense. I don't have to be worried. I don't have to be scared. I might want to slow down, but this makes sense. Whereas for instance, in the example I previously gave, where if you're sitting in a room and everything is pretty calm and all of a sudden you start feeling really uncomfortable, like your stomach doesn't feel right, or you start breathing quickly, or you start having a so-called anxiety or panic attack, in large part that's because the shift in your bodily sensations doesn't match or doesn't correspond to something in the outside world. So there's this incredible triad, which includes the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the cingulate or anterior cingulate cortex, and the insula. And those three are working together in a kind of conversation. It's a neural conversation, but a conversation nonetheless, trying to figure out, okay, what's going on inside me? How do I feel? What am I thinking about? And this could be thoughts about the past or the future or the present. They are also in a conversation as to whether or not the sensations that you're experiencing, meaning how quick your breathing is or how slow your breathing is, how your heart feels, how your skin feels, any sensations of pain or pleasure for that matter, whether or not that makes sense for the situation you're in, and trying to determine whether or not you are doing the right things as a consequence of those sensations. Okay, so again, if you can't remember the names of these different neural structures in the brain, don't worry about it. It's really not that critical. What is critical is that you understand that there's a conversation that's constantly occurring as long as you are awake, trying to figure out what's going on inside of you and whether or not it makes sense relative to what's going on outside and around you. Now, humans are smart. That is, we are, to some extent, conscious of the fact that we have memories of the past, awareness of the present, and anticipation of the future. So we do realize, for instance, that we can be seated at the dinner table, and have a thought about something tomorrow, maybe an exam that's stressing us out or something like that, and that will change our bodily state in a way that is not optimal for what we're doing in the moment, but that can still make sense to us because that exam is important. Maybe we're feeling some pressure about a hard conversation we have to have, or maybe we are very excited about the next day and we can't eat because we're so excited. And that can make perfect sense to us because we do have access to this knowledge about self that we can think about the past, the present, or the future. So that makes the conversation these three structures are in even more interesting and dynamic, because what it means is that we can be doing something, eating, talking, running, any number of different activities, and our bodily state may or may not match what we are doing in a way that's adaptive for that, and yet that can be completely okay or at least understandable for us. Now, a major emphasis of a meditation practice is to make us so-called more mindful. What is mindfulness? Well, again, there isn't one perfect, universally accepted operational definition of mindfulness. That's basically nerd speak for saying people can't agree exactly what mindfulness should be, is, and means for everyone. But most people assume, and I think agree, that mindfulness includes something about being present. And when I say present, that doesn't necessarily mean present to one's surroundings, because of course a lot of meditation practices that are designed to make us more mindful and present are designed to make us more mindful and present to what's happening internally while ignoring everything that's happening externally. But they are designed to make us more present to our bodily sensations, and in particular our breathing and our thoughts in the moment.